The idea of there being flying, female, dangerous, vampiric beings can be traced very far back.
Welcome to Witch Hunt, the podcast that talks about the history and lore surrounding witchcraft accusations. I'm Sarah Jack.
And I'm Josh Hutchinson. Today we're tackling a really fascinating and persistent piece of witch lore, the flying ointment.
Were there really hallucinogenic potions that made people believe they could fly? We're thrilled to have Dr. Michael Ostling with us today to discuss this. Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcast, Dr. Ostling. Please tell us about your expertise and what are we going to talk about today?
So I think we're mostly going to talk about the myth of the witch's flight ointment, the hallucinogenic flight ointment. But I'm happy to talk about anything else that also comes up. I am a historian of witchcraft, a humanities scholar specializing in all aspects of witchcraft and magic, primarily in Europe and the Americas, but also more globally.
In our discussion about the witch's flying ointment today, are we talking about the physical world or are we talking about a different reality where witches flew?
So it's my working assumption that witches never flew, that the idea that witches flew is a mixture of folklore and demonology. So it comes out of culture, not out of reality. And I think that assumption that witches never physically flew is shared by all modern scholars. But there are some scholars, some, I would say, real scholars, some more pseudo-scholars or pseudoscientists who would like to make the claim that witches understood themselves to fly in the same sense that somebody taking LSD or psilocybin mushrooms or peyote might experience themselves as flying.
And what era did witches start doing that?
It depends on what you mean. The idea of there being flying, female, dangerous, vampiric beings can be traced very far back. We have the Lamii or Lilith, the Jewish demoness. Some of those can go back well into 1,000 years or so BCE, probably even earlier, because the notion that there are dangerous beings out there in this world that fly by night, that maybe take the form of screech owls or bats or night ravens or those sorts of things, and can sneak up on you at night and suck your blood. That seems to be I wouldn't call it a universal. I'm very careful about not assigning universality to things unless I'm quite sure, but it's certainly very, very widespread. The attachment of that image of the flying night demon to actual human women, you can see traces of that already in some Roman literature, but really more as a literary construct, not something that seems to have been taken seriously in real life, or at least not that seriously. You have the claims made in the Canon Episcopi, which is a Christian document, that there are women who think that they go out on night journeys. The Canon Episcopi doesn't exactly say that they fly, but sort of a suggestion of some kind of magical journey. But the Canon Episcopi is very clear that this is a superstition. So this is a Christian Catholic document that says it is not the case, right? It is not true that women fly. Anyone who thinks that women fly is incorrect in their faith. And then you really start getting the notion that witches fly with the formation of the mythology of the witches' Sabbath, because you have this question, how do they all get to this big gathering, often described as a really large gathering, right? If your witches' Sabbath is a few women gathered in a basement somewhere, well, they could have just walked there. But as you start getting these stories elicited, usually under torture, of these fast gatherings of witches from all over the country or from all over the world, well, they have to get there somewhere. And the way that is usually depicted is in terms of flying.
And what were early theories when the flight was specifically attached to witches. What were early theories about how they flew?
So you have a really strong split between a demonological theory and a theory or a set of theories associated with people who understood themselves to be natural philosophers or natural magicians. So it's anachronistic to describe such people as scientists, but certainly people who were trying to understand the world through means of nature rather than supernature. And the demonological theory is earlier, and it comes out of a long discourse within Christianity about the powers of Satan. Satan is a spirit. The world is material. How do spirits interact with the world? This was a question that scholastic philosophers turned over and over in all sorts of different directions. And they came up with really ingenious, really interesting ideas about, well, spirit is sort of like air, so it's not completely immaterial, it's just this very refined material. And so a spirit like Satan could condense himself into air the same way that the wind, right? The wind seems very spiritual, very immaterial, but when it blows, you feel it, right? Or he could animate a human corpse in various ways. So you have this long-standing, really just theological, philosophical set of questions about the powers of Satan. And then when you start getting this mythology about the witches traveling to the Sabbath, well, Satan took them there, right? Satan carried them. So that's the demonological theory. He picked them up. They sometimes claim or say that they rode on a broomstick, or they rode on a shovel, or they rode on a chair, or on a horse, or on a feather, or on all sorts of things, or that they turned into birds. But all of this is the witches have no power under this theological model. Any power they seem to have is coming from the devil. And so if they seem to fly, or if they do physically fly, it's the devil carrying them.
So, when we talk about hallucinogenic witch's ointment, is that an opposing theory? Is that something that came later? There's not a diabolical piece to that that's giving power back to the witches?
So, in its original intent, the theory advanced by some 16th and 17th century medical doctors, natural magicians, and natural philosophers is to debunk the idea of witches' flight. It is not to give power back to the witches. It is to say, there are no witches. And so in many ways, this intent is something that we might align with, right? These are people who are saying, you are torturing people, you are executing people for an impossible crime, right? They can't fly. People can't fly. There are, these people claim, and these are going to be people like Giovanni della Porta, Francis Bacon, or Johann Weir, who of course was a famous skeptic of the witch trials. There are old women who think that they fly, and there's various reasons they might think this. All of these theories, interestingly, are grounded in misogyny. So on the one hand, they are trying to save the lives of women before the courts, and that's admirable. They do so by saying these women are crazy, right? They are delusional, they are hallucinating. Veer says old women, especially old peasant women, they're always eating turnips and cabbage and beans. They're just farting a lot. They're like, he literally says that. They're having like bad digestion while they sleep and having nightmares and thinking that they're flying. And because they're old women and old women are stupid, says Veer, they turn this into this whole fantasy of going to the Sabbath. Again, his intentions are really good. His intentions are to save the lives of innocent women, but his method is interestingly misogynistic. So it could be cabbage and beans, or, says Veer and others, it could be the product of a hallucinogen. They could be using an ointment that is hallucinogenic. And the reason that Veer and Cardano and Della Porta and others have this theory available to them that witches might be using a hallucinogenic ointment is that they are themselves natural philosophers, medical doctors, men, Latin speakers, very educated, and they know that there exists and had existed for years anesthetic ointments that had potential hallucinogenic side effects. So they are not making this up, but they are projecting onto the accused witches their own knowledge of ancient and medieval Greek and Latin medicine having to do with opium and the nightshades and other hallucinogenic or otherwise psychotropic botanical substances.
How did this ointment work? Did they just rub a little on themselves, or they grease their broom, or how did they use this ointment?
So again, it depends on which theory you're looking at. In the demonological theory, the devil is making them fly, right? And the devil is tricking them into thinking that they have a magical power. Because this is the basis of the witchcraft belief in early modern Europe in general, at least in its Orthodox Christian form. Witches have no power. All of the power is the devil's. And the devil allows women and some men to think that if they say certain words or make certain ritual gestures or use certain substances, things will happen. And those things do happen, but only because the devil is doing. And so the demonologists go out of their way to say, look, insofar as the witches have an ointment, it doesn't work. If they fly, it's because the devil makes them fly. And so they can put it on themselves however they want. It doesn't matter. Some of them put it on their hands. Some of them put it on their feet. Some put it on the broom. Some put it all over their naked bodies. Some touch the tops of their heads. It's actually emphasized in these demonological accounts that it's put on in all kinds of different ways, and it really doesn't matter how they do it because it doesn't work anyways. When you look at people like Francis Bacon or Johann Weir or Della Porta, because they're making a claim that insofar as accused witches think they fly, they are hallucinating the flight, and they're using a hallucinogenic ointment. For it to work, they really have to rub it in, right? They have to be putting a lot of it on themselves, rubbing it in vigorously, getting it in all their nooks and crannies. Because again, there existed at this time an analgesic ointment used in some surgeries, but it wasn't all that effective, and you kind of needed a lot. So there's no evidence. I've never seen any evidence that any accused witch ever had access to or even knowledge of these learned medicinal ointments, which would have been used by sort of high-class medical doctors trained in Galenic medicine, Picardian medicine. But men trained in this tradition would claim that it might be possible that the accused witches were using these ointments and, again, really sort of rubbing them in all over their bodies.
I was thinking about the narrative of a lot of accused witches having been healers. So it's interesting. I wonder how that fits into that origin story or narrative when you have men that have the access and the knowledge to medicines that women wouldn't have had.
So it's actually really a minority of accused witches who were practicing healers. That is also a little bit of a myth, and I can come back on another time and go into that. That is less of a myth than the myth of the hallucinogenic ointment. Certainly a significant minority of accused witches practiced as healers, including using various herbal mixtures. Absolutely. But really the minority. But the plants claimed to be used in the hallucinogenic ointment were not the sorts of plants that you found in the pharmacopoeia of a village healer. Some of them did not exist in Europe, so it was sometimes claimed that the witches might use datura, which is a very powerful hallucinogen from the New World, obviously not available in the Old. Insofar as it might have been available, it would have been very expensive. Mandrake is from the Mediterranean. Any account of mandrake in Northern Europe, again, it's not impossible that someone might have imported some. And in fact, we do know that fake mandrake was very popular in Northern Europe. So various other roots like calamus or iris root would be doctored to look like mandrake. If you know what mandrake root looks like, it looks vaguely kind of sort of like a human being, like ginseng has. It often has sort of two roots, so it's like two legs. And the other roots would be doctored to look like mandrake and sold as magic charms. Those are not going to work, right? This is iris root or calamus root. They don't have any hallucinogenic properties. So again, it's not impossible. I don't want to rule out the possibility that some accused witch somewhere might have used, for example, belladonna, deadly nightshade, pretty common, really a weed in Europe. There are some very, very equivocal accounts of nightshade being used in a very few trials, never as an ointment for flying. When it's reported in a trial, it's used in other ways for other things. But we just don't find in the trials any accused witch, whether she was in fact an herbal healer or not, making anything that looks like a hallucinogenic ointment.
Thank you.
So there's basically what I'm understanding is there's no documentation that anybody accused of witchcraft actually used the ointment.
Yeah, there really is not. So there are people who try to make the claim, but there are documents and they're just unsuccessful. So, for example, Edward Beaver, who's a contemporary historian who has made some arguments about the hallucinogenic ointments, he says he knows of one trial in 1651 in which an accused witch chewed what she called bitter almonds, and this helped her fly. And she also rubbed some on her skin. And he says, okay, bitter almonds, maybe those were nightshade berries. So, a few things to observe. One, this is one trial. Even if it is completely true, and I don't think it is, that this accused witch used nightshade to have the experience of flying, basing an entire sort of theory of the origin of witches' flight and the origin of the witch trials, even on this hallucinogenic premise. It's pretty weak if you have just one trial. But she didn't make an ointment. She rubbed some berries, some bitter almonds on herself. And nightshade berries, they don't look like bitter almonds at all, right? The bitter almond looks like an almond. It is the pit of a kind of apricot. Nightshade berries are little berries. They're depending on the species or subspecies. They're white or black or kind of reddish. It is hard to see how someone could misidentify a nightshade berry, which is hallucinogenic, with a bitter almond. So you do have modern historians really grasping, I would say, at straws, finding here and there very cherry-picked examples to hold up this belief that there is a physical basis for the myth of witches' flight.
Thank you. I really, really enjoyed hearing you talk about the harvest of the earth today, getting to hear about all these ingredients. We haven't had anybody share so much expertise on that, and it's really been enjoyable. But I know these ointments have theories that include some detestable ingredients. Can you tell us about?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the demonological theory, again, witches, insofar as they fly by Satan's power, the ointment has no power. So what is the point of the ointment in the demonological view? It is a indication of just how horrible witches are, right? If witches are the opposite of good Christians, the ointment is going to incorporate things that good Christians should not be involved with. So if a good Christian makes use of the Eucharist in the proper way, the ointment might make use of the Eucharist in an improper way. If a good Christian eats the right Christian foods, meat from cows, pigs, chickens, this is going to be the wrong kind of meat, right? Eye of Nuv, fur of bat, that sort of thing. And if good Christian women nurture and feed their children, if that's the emblem of what a good Christian woman is, then the witch, of course, kills children and cooks them in this inversion of proper womanly behavior. Sometimes to eat them, sometimes there are suggestions of cannibalism, but more usually to render their fat and use it as part of her ointment. And so just for the experience of this entertainment of flying and flying where? To a place where she gets to have lots of weird sex. Witches are such bad women, such evil women, that they kill children to make their ointments. So in the demonological theory, the ointment, again, has no actual effect, but is an emblem, a symbol of everything that is terrible about the witch. There's a disturbing tendency in a lot of the supposedly scientific sounding accounts of the witch's ointment from the last 50 years that is very sexualized. What I find fascinating and disturbing about this is you get these accounts written nearly always by men, and these are usually men who are or seem, or I think are, very respectable. They are not historians, they are pharmacologists, toxicologists, botanists, experts in various kinds of chemistry. And they say, hey, I figured it out. This is why witches think they flew. Listen, they made an ointment out of hallucinogens. They rubbed it on the broomstick, and they used that broomstick as an applicator. They never say as a dildo, as a sex toy, but it's pretty clear what they're saying. As an applicator in order to introduce the ointment to their mucosa, by which they mean essentially their vulva or vagina or anus, and then they went on this trip. That idea that the broom was used as a phallic object covered in grease, covered in ointment, a lubricant that was then introduced through penetration, that traces back to Michael Harner, a scholar, in many ways a good scholar of shamanism in the early 1970s. It doesn't have earlier roots. It doesn't really show up in the witch trials, which is surprising because the witch trials loved to dwell on the sexual proclivities of the accused witches.
Yeah.
But it shows up. It shows up in the last 50 years, and it is just very disturbing to me that one takes as one excuse for dwelling on the hypersexualization of the accused witches, this claimed scientific key to the witch trials. Why were 50,000 women burned in early modern Europe? Well, because some women were using hallucinogenic dildos. It's, again, just tremendously, tremendously disrespectful.
Yeah. That brings so many questions to mind, but I am curious, when you're looking at convictions that were sexual crimes, do we find women committing crimes with dildos?
No, in the demonology and in some of the trials, you get a lot of accounts of witches having sex with the wrong kind of people. So sometimes this is incest, having sex with the wrong kind of people because they're having same-sex relations, sex with the wrong kind of being because they're having sex with cats or goats or Satan. You have very lubricious accounts of Satan's penis being extra big or forked or scaly. You also have very commonly kind of pushing against the idea of this like extra pleasurable penis. You have claims that the devil's penis is icy cold. So you really do have a fascination in the early modern period on the part of the demonologists, on the part of these men. How are the witches doing it, right? They want to talk about that a lot. But this is, again, entirely fantasy. Very occasionally, it does seem to be the case that a woman originally came to be accused because she was of quote unquote ill fame as a sexually promiscuous person, right? So she was an adulteress. She was a prostitute. She was a procuress. That shows up for sure. But most of the women accused of witchcraft were not saints and not whatever the opposite of a saint is. They were ordinary human beings, right? Some of them probably cheated on their husbands. Many of them probably didn't. Their sexual lives remain mostly closed to us.
Yeah. And it's disturbing because it, like, the broom, of course, is this domestic symbol. That's part of the witch story. But then to then sexualize the same prop, that's something.
Yeah, and this sexualization of the broom was probably there from early on. The very first picture we have of a woman flying on a broom, which is from the 15th century, a person astride a broom, it is suggestive, right? We have uh, Albrecht Dürer's famous engraving of a witch riding backwards on a goat, and she's holding, it's not a broom, it's probably a distaff, but it's a phallic looking domestic object, and she's holding it in a way that kind of looks like a penis. So this is very, very standard in the depictions, the artistic depictions of witches, that they are repurposing domestic items in a sexual way. This sort of came to be always a broom in later stories, right? It's only in the 19th and 20th century that it comes to be just standardly a broom. Before that, it is a butter churn, which also has kind of a phallic part to it, the part that pounds the butter. Distaffs, which are used to spin yarn, which are like a stick. Brooms, rakes, shovels. So in the depictions of witches, you nearly always have these sort of phallic objects. In the trials themselves, they flew in all kinds of ways. Sometimes on a broom, sometimes on a rake or a distaff or a butter churn, but also in a tub, in a sieve, on the back of a wool, on the back of a swallow, right? Some of these, if you kind of squint, you can make them sexual. Most of them you can't. So what we have in the demonology, in the art depicting witches, and then really continuing into the 20th and 21st centuries, in this retrojection of male fantasies onto the bodies of women in ways that are, disturbing.
So did these women who were traveling to the Sabbat, did they know that were they astrally projecting, or were they attempting to get there physically somehow?
There are testimonies of women traveling to the Sabbath are almost without exception elicited under torture from women who probably at least in the early century or so of the witch trials, had not heard of the witches' Sabbath until they were accused of it and asked about it, right? Now, this idea from demonology, it does soak down into local folklores through, among other things, the mechanism of the witch trials. So after a century or so, sure, people know about the witches' Sabbath. But at least early on, people are saying they're being tortured. And they're asked, where did you go? How did you get there? What did you do? Isn't it true that you had sex with the devil? Isn't it true that you committed incest and ate lizards and all these things? They say, yes, I did all those things. So they did not think they were astrally projecting. They did not think they were physically flying. They didn't think anything. They're confessing to something imposed on them. That being said, it is true that in a few corners of Europe, there are folk traditions of a of various kinds of night journey. So we have the Benandanti in Friuli, it was sort of northeastern Italy. We have what's sometimes called the dream cult of the ladies from outside in southern Italy. We have the cult of the Sealy Whites in Scotland. And our evidence for these, in some cases, pretty good, in other cases, less good. But certainly there are traditions in parts of Southeastern Europe, far Southern Europe, maybe Scotland, maybe the Baltics, of people having some kind of shamanistic type flight. As is typical of folk traditions, these are not strongly theorized. So is this astral projection? Is this a second soul? Is this the shadow? Is it the physical body? It doesn't really matter. Different stories are different. You don't get these kinds of nitpicky questions until either early modern inquisitors or modern historians, anthropologists, scientists start trying to make these distinctions.
Has anybody found any physical evidence, like traces of the ointment or anything like that?
So when I was researching this a few years ago, I found an article that did claim that it had found some traces of the ointment, and it was very excitingly. We finally found some witch's ointment, and it turned out to be sort of a nothing burger. Like they had found a salve of some kinds in a peasant dwelling, and of course, people use salves, right? People used ointments as we still do. People moisturized in peasant economies, highly dependent on dairy. Some of our most popular moisturizing creams today are called like Milkmaid's Friend or things like that. Udder ointments for the chapped udders of cows or for the chapped hands of milkmaids were really common. For example, in one Polish trial, they did find an ointment. They were very excited. And it turned out to be, it was a stone crop mixed with butter. And interestingly, in 19th and 20th century Poland, stone crop mixed with butter is still a very standard ointment for your hands, for your face. Stone crop is not a hallucinogen. It's like chamomile or like lilac or other things you might put into your lip balm or your moisturizers. So those sorts of ointments, sure, yeah, we find those. We have never found anything like a hallucinogenic witch's ointment, and they were looked for, right? In the Basque witch trial, one of the biggest sets of witch trials in the early 17th century, the inquisitors did go out into the villages and into the huts and look for ointments, and they found them. And then when they were looked at more carefully by the second set of inquisitors who came to kind of clean up this witch hunt because it had been this sort of huge fiasco, and an inquisitor named Alonso de Salazar Frias came out and said, look, this whole thing was a witch craze, right? Made up. They already had these ointments in evidence, and they looked at them again, and they were made out of things like pork fat mixed with soot, or various sort of standard innocuous local herbs mixed with butter. Again, they were just the sorts of ointments people would have for various reasons, practical or medicinal, in their homes.
All of this is just mind-boggling and interesting. You can really see how perceived authoritative writings and consensus just really impacted culture. It makes me think of the impact of the Malleus Maleficarum, and then over here you have these ointment theories. In your article, you touch on the cultural significance of thinking with ointments and about this reality and imagination debate. What do we need to recognize looking back?
Sure. So I wrote an article called Baby Fat and Belladonna. And I really wrote that after a few years of teaching a undergraduate course on the witch trials. And anyone who teaches an undergraduate course on the witch trials will always get a student or two or three who say, well, I heard, and they will have heard various things, right? They'll have heard of ergot poisoning. So the theory that the accused witches were poisoned by this fungus that sometimes grows on rye. That's a big claim in the Salem trials, long, long debunked. Or that the accused witches all suffered from hysteria, or there's all sorts of myths. And so I wanted to debunk the particular myth that came up every year in my class, which was, well, isn't it true that they made use of a hallucinogenic ointment? And the answer is no. But more than just wanting to debunk this myth, I became really interested in the resilience of the myth, because it resurfaces literally every few years in quite respectable places, in websites devoted to popular science, usually around Halloween, in websites devoted to popular history, also around Halloween, in journals of toxicology or pharmacology, in certain types of sort of reductionist or materialist history. It just comes up over and over again. Hey, we figured it out. Now we know why people mistakenly thought that witches flew. It's figured out. We've nailed it down. There were these ointments. They rubbed them on themselves. They thought they flew. It wasn't true. Now we know. And I find this very frustrating, not only because it isn't true, but because it's really disrespectful to the accused witches, right? I understand my responsibility as a scholar studying these people, making my living out of their stories, to try to tell those stories as accurately as I can, to try to understand both the accused and the accuser as accurately as I can, and as much as I can to not project my own fantasies or my own contemporary concerns onto their stories, onto their minds, onto their burned bodies. I think that's just a baseline ethical requirement of anyone studying these materials. Because after all, that's how the witch trials themselves happened, right? Demonologists on the one hand and village accusers on the others project onto the real bodies and lives of real women their own dehumanizing myths and narratives and stories about monsters, vampires, heretics. So I can't be repeating that pattern myself. And so when we make these claims that the accused witches really were understanding themselves to fly and really were experiencing a subjective but real hallucinated orgy, that might play well to some of us today, right? We have a fantasy cult of free love retrojected into the Middle Ages. We have a nice story about the long pedigree of Hutchins, again, retrojected into the Middle Ages. But it's not true. Insofar as I want to understand what these women were experiencing, why they were accused, how they understood their own lives, with the very marginal, but of course important exception of some accused witches who were members of these sort of semi-shamanistic practices in some areas of Europe. None of them understood themselves to be witches, right? None of them understood themselves to worship Satan or a horned god. None of them understood themselves to be traveling to orgies. Just none of these things. It's a fantasy. And it's not their fantasy. It's men's fantasy. It's the demonologist's fantasy. So I just can't be any part of that. And it is ironic. It's funny and strange that the particular myth of the ointment originates itself as a debunking move. Natural scientists, natural philosophers, medical men are saying, hey, these women, they're not witches, they're just hallucinating. That's in the 16th and 17th centuries. And then in the 19th and 20th and 21st century, other men and women take that debunking story and use it to claim that the witches were real, that they really existed as an underground, ecstatic, shamanistic, hallucinogen using cult. I just think it's disrespectful.
I think that's such an important point to remember, that we're talking about witch hunts against innocent people, and to not visualize them as having done what they were accused of. Yeah. So important.
Yeah. And the distinction that they themselves were not identifying in a religious manner, even as practicing something diabolical or to match modern practices that people enjoy or identify as. It's a whole different template that was put on these lives. Earlier in the discussion, you pointed out the misogyny in the ointment theory, and I really appreciated that. I think we use that word around the witch hunts in these stories, but sometimes we don't point out how it was there, and I think that was a really good point today. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, misogyny pervades every aspect of the early modern witch hunts. Absolutely. The Malleus Maleficarum, which you mentioned by Heinrich Kramer or Heinrich Instatoris, one of the foundational demonological documents of the witch hunts, just noxious in its misogyny, saying all sorts of things about how witches are the descendants of Eve, who brought sin into the world, and they do everything backwards. And why are there more women who are witches than men? Because women in general are lusty, foolish, weak, easily seduced by the devil, contrary to logic. I mean, they really sound like your drunken uncle at Thanksgiving, right? They're just terrible. Those are the demonologists. So then you turn to the people who are defending or at least casting doubt on demonology. Johann Gier would be the best example of this. And one would assume, okay, he's going to be not misogynistic. Unfortunately, no, right? His defense of the accused witches is, come on, women are crazy. You can't believe what they say or what they think or what they feel. They're hallucinating, they're eating cabbage and beans, or they're just being old women, right? And old women make up all kinds of stuff. So there's no place safe from misogyny in the story, except maybe in our retelling of these stories. We can try and avoid retelling these misogynistic tropes as if they were fact, because they fit or can be made to fit aspects of our thinking today.
You talked earlier about how people who use these substances today do experience a sensation of light. Has anybody recreated one of the ointments?
So I should make 2 points. One is that there are, of course, shamanistic practices that make use of nightshade hallucinogens, especially in the Americas, right? Datura is or was used in a variety of shamanistic practices by a variety of indigenous peoples in the Southeast and Southwest. Peyote is, of course, not a nightshade, but has similar effects and is important in some Native American religions. You have things like ayahuasca. So it's completely reasonable to have the idea that early modern witches might have been doing something similar. It really is a reasonable idea. It's wrong, but it's reasonable. And I don't want to cast any shade at all on the entheogenic use of phytochemical hallucinogens in all sorts of indigenous traditions, which is clearly something, again, primarily in sort of ranging from Southwest down through Central and South America is a big part of lots of indigenous traditions. It just happens not to be true of early modern Europe. So there is one person, Jules Erich Peukert, a German folklorist who, in the early mid 20th century, reconstructed the ointment. Very important to remember, he did not reconstruct an ointment ever recorded in any witch trial. So he is not reconstructing the witch's ointment. He is reconstructing the natural philosophers' imagination of the witch's ointment based on those natural philosophers' knowledge of Greek and Roman and medieval medicine. So these natural philosophers know that opium is a narcotic. They know that henbane and belladonna and mandrake contain alkaloids that are hallucinogenic and had been used in a small way in analgesic ointments since the 12th century. They know this because these men themselves are trained as doctors, right? So these 16th and 17th century men say, hey, I think the witches probably used something like what we sometimes use. And they describe the ointment and they give the ingredients henbane, belladonna, mandrake, opium. And then Peukert in the 20th century says, hey, I can make that. And he does. And he applied it to his armpits and his genitalia. And he reports having a 30-hour trip that was very similar to some of the sorts of things described in demonology and sometimes described in witch trials. So flying, a party with all sorts of strange looking beings, interacting with and talking to all sorts of beings, right? In my opinion, and I say this in my article, that was the first time anyone ever actually experienced hallucinogenic witch flight was in the early 20th century.
Well, is there any documents or letters of a woman writing about her experiences?
No. Sorry for that short answer, but there's
Yeah.
not. No,
Yeah.
there's not. Now, what I try to do, and I think most responsible scholars of the witch trials try to do, is read the trials very, very carefully. Because what I think we don't want to do is say, because because the testimony, the confessions of the witches were extracted under torture, nothing about them can be believed. We can't say anything about the lives of these women. We just have to be silent. We just have to say, no, no, no. I don't know anything about them. I think that is a understandable position. And it is more responsible than some other positions, which are like, oh, I'm going to make up. But it also re-silences the victims of the witch trials, right? We say, sorry, the documentation is too fragmentary, the evidence is too tainted. We just don't know what they felt or thought at all, and we're just going to be silent about it. We can read things carefully. We can triangulate between testimony given before torture and testimony given during torture. We can triangulate between what we know contextually about the religion of the time or the folklore of the time and confessions. We can use all sorts of tools to try and figure out what the accused witches might have actually done or thought or felt. And when we do that, we do find when the accused witches are compelled to talk about their ointments, sometimes they fall straight into what is probably being pushed on them. So yes, it's made out of babies, right? It's made out of bat's blood, that sort of thing. And sometimes they start talking about the herbs which they do use in their lives, usually not because they are professional healers, but just because they are people living in the 16th and 17th century. And if you live in those centuries, especially if you're a woman, you know some herbs. I live in modern times. I use modern medicines, but I am aware of chamomile, golden seal, right? Like, so is any normal person. So again, under torture, what is your ointment made out of? And they say, well, it's made out of butter and, this herb or that herb. And the herbs that they end up confessing to most often are not hallucinogenic herbs. And they're not even quite often really medicinal herbs that have like a strong medicinal property. They are more often the herbs that are used ritually to ward off evil. So think about the irony of that, right? It is part of ritual practice across Europe in the early modern period, a little bit less so in Protestant areas than in Catholic areas, to hang various vegetative substances in places like doorways, windows, above bed. These are often things used for Easter palms. So on Palm Sunday, Sunday before Easter, nowadays, most often because we have access to palm trees, an actual palm frond is sort of folded into the shape of a little cross, right? And people take these home. And again, they hang them in their windows and their doors, above their beds, as a little protective amulet. In Northern Europe in the early modern period, nobody had access to palm trees. So they call it Palm Sunday. They understand that it is because palm trees are described in the Bible, but they don't have palm trees. So they bring to the church various flowers, herbs, other things usually that just like smell nice. And those are their palms. And they have them blessed, and then they bring them home and they hang them in places. And the ashes used on Ash Wednesday are traditionally made from burning last year's palms. So that's just sort of standard Catholic tradition. You have an accused witch. She's being forced under torture to describe her ointment, and she starts describing the herbs that she really does use to protect herself from misfortune, to protect herself from the devil, to protect herself from witches. But now, because she's being tortured, she's describing these as the ingredients to her ointment.
Yeah.
So the irony there is just incredible.
Thank you so much again for being here today. This has been really enjoyable.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Witch Hunt.
Have you subscribed to our YouTube channels yet? Do it today.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.